Well, I'm glad to be with you, and this is a challenging conversation we're going to have, and my goal is to just give you my best thinking to date for interaction with you all, and processing in true Presbyterian fashion, honoring the priesthood of the believers and discussing together and trying to get a sense of the mind of God in terms of how to move forward to achieve the great ends of the church, which is the goal that you all strive for, which, if you summarize that, really is making disciples, as Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 28. And so my goal is to have I'll share some stuff with you and have some dialogue with you as we go through this process. And in an ideal scenario, there would be some sense of confirmation from the lead team, so that when the report goes to the Presbytery in the February meeting, it's not just me speaking, but rather this is the recommendations that the lead team is making through the interaction that we've done. And then, of course, there'll be further gatherings and processing of that at the Presbytery level to figure out what God is saying to move forward. But it would be my desire that that presentation would come the February 27th or whatever the meeting is. Don't hold me to that. It's somewhere in that time frame. Then there'd be some time for some gatherings and processing, even in March and in April, and then coming back to the Presbytery in the end of April, and Lord willing, actually adopt and embrace one or more of the strategic directions to move forward, which will take a number of years to implement. And I just want to let you know that it's taken at least 40, 45 years or longer to get in the state that you're in. And so there's not three simple points that if you just do this and change the colors here and adopt this, that it's all going to move forward. But I do believe that God, in fact, wants to accomplish his mission. I do believe that God wants to use Presbyterians in doing that. I do believe that Presbyterians have had a rich history in engaging in God's mission together, and I do believe that the future is still bright if you will align yourself with what God is wanting. And so I'm a person, as you know, is rather straightforward in my speaking. I mean what I say what I mean. It's what you see is what you get. And if I didn't believe that there was a bright future, I wouldn't stand up here and say that. Now, I didn't say it's an easy future to get to. It will be challenging, it will be hard, it will be difficult, but it is possible. Why? Because it's God's mission, and as solid Reformed people, you understand that we're in partnership with the sovereign God who accomplishes his purposes to redeem mankind and to extend his kingdom here. And so we know that's his will, so therefore it must be possible if we can align ourselves with God's heart and with his ways and his purposes. Now see, if I was talking to Baptists, I would say, anybody want to say amen to that? But I know that's a little less thing. So the key issue as I see it is sort of what's the overarching theme? And really thinking and praying about this and talking with folks about it, I think the overarching theme is to commit to passing on faith to the next generation. To pass on faith to the next generation. Jesus gave the command to make disciples, to make disciples, to make disciples, and you and I are followers of Jesus today because his followers have faithfully carried that out in the power of the Holy Spirit through the years. And we are here. And it would seem that if you're going to write the history of this presbytery, I don't think anybody would say we want the history of this one to be, this is the generation in which the faith died. that we didn't pass it on. I know we agree on that, and that's a mandate of what Jesus gave in the Great Commission. It's also the mandate that Paul gave, to the things you've seen in me, put in others, who raise up others, who raise up others. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. And so we're looking to pass on that faith, and I think there's 4 characteristics, I think, of what it means to be historically Presbyterian. That is, to be Reformed in theology, to be Presbyterian in governance, which you understand that even better than I, but the process there, to be multi-ethnic and multicultural in scope, to look at the whole scope of the harvest, make disciples of all nations, ethne, and then finally, disciple-making oriented. And so that's the challenge that we have, is to say, how can we cooperate and partner with God in this context at this time to begin to move forward toward the future that God would want to carry out that mandate that he gave in Matthew chapter 28. So I'm going to propose to you 6 strategic initiatives that help to inform a direction of how to move forward. You can't make a plan until one has actually acknowledged and embraced the initiatives and said, this is the direction we want to go. But how we're going to get there is going to be a bit of a challenge. Now, there's a fine book that, what's his name? Todd Bolsinger wrote called Canoeing the Mountains. Who's read that particular one? Well, the opening illustration and the organizing principle of the book is worth the price of the book itself, which he tells the story of those explorers, Lewis and Clark. And they were commissioned to go find the Northwest Passage, and so they started their canoes and things going up the rivers, and they were going up and up and up and up and up and up, and they were expecting to be able to just get over this one little knoll, and they would find the river that's going down to the Pacific on the other side, and lo and behold, they get to that little knoll, they go over the knoll, and what do they see? The Rocky Mountains. And that was a big, huge disappointment and challenge, because these explorers were very skilled as river navigators. They knew how to handle boats, and they knew how to do that kind of stuff, and they knew how to fish and hunt and do the kinds of things to sustain themselves as they go along their journey. They were not experienced in mountaineering. And so part of the challenge that they had to face is they had to figure out how to overcome the obstacles of climbing the mountains by learning some new things that they had never learned, they never knew before, and had to improvise and support each other and come alongside of each other, because they kept the goal clearly in mind. And in fact, with many difficulties and some help from some strategic Native Americans, particularly one woman in particular, that helped to guide them and help them along, they were actually able to be successful in discovering the Northwest. Now, it wasn't a waterway, it was something completely different at that point, but nevertheless, it's how do you learn as you go and figure it out. That's the overarching principle. So that the obvious implication is that the Presbyterian structure and ways of doing things have worked incredibly well for a long, long time, and now those ways are not working, and so therefore some new things are going to need to be learned. And that's why you can't just lay out a plan, because in some ways you don't know what the plan is going to be and what is going to really be the way forward to figure out how to get over the mountains to continue to cooperate with God's mission in the world today. So that's the backdrop of the place where you're at. How to go from being river navigators to mountaineers. How to go from a very stable environment that worked nicely in the 50s, but now many years later is no longer effective in connecting with today's context. So, here are the initiatives. Initiative number 1. Seek God together as you refocus on the mission. Seek God together as you focus on the mission. Now, how do you do that as a first step? I would suggest 2 things by way of recommendation in implementing this. Number 1, I would recommend that you take the time that you devote to your Presbytery meetings and devote a full 50% of your meeting time to seeking God, prayer, worship, focusing on the mission, praying for God to raise up the workers, asking God to cultivate a heart of compassion, asking God for leadership to be raised up from various culture groups around. That this is something that absolutely everybody could do if they wanted to. And I suggest to do that because one of the things that I've observed, it seems like there's quite a reverence, if you would, for the way in which you conduct business. Now, I understand that Presbyterians are supposed to do things decently and in order. I get that. And I am not suggesting that you go out and be chaotic and turn into Pentecostals or Baptists. You're Presbyterians, and it was ordained by God that you be Presbyterians. Just as it was ordained that I was baptized in a Presbyterian church, and I was a very excellent Presbyterian for the first 5 years of my life. So anything that good has happened in my life probably comes from those kinds of roots that I have and the heritage. But seriously, what would make a statement stronger than to completely make a significant transformation of how you allocate time in your Presbytery meetings? And some of you are saying, well, we won't get all the business done. So, what's more important? Seeking God or getting through the agenda? What's more important, responding to the promptings of the Spirit and listening to each other and trying to discern what God is up to? Asking God to change your hearts to reflect His heart? There are certainly ways to be efficient, and I'm not saying be irresponsible about the carrying out of your business, but making a statement of 50% of the time, because where we spend our time shows us what is important. And so worship is not just a tack on at the end, it's something that's integral to the very whole of what it means to be reformed. In fact, that is, if you go back in history, you see that was the way in which they did operate. That's the way in which they did function. That's how they did it. They were discerning together in their dialogues and processing and prayer, etc. Where is God working? How do we cooperate with it? And what initiatives do we take in light of that? So that's the first recommendation I give to take seriously that one, and that's one that everybody can do. And the challenge would be if some people start complaining, we're spending too much time on this, well, do I even need to finish the sentence? I won't. I'll leave it, because it's, as my brother used to say, it's trivially obvious to the most casual observer. The second thing I would recommend is that you initiate regional gatherings for churches to come together to pray, to share each other's stories, to encourage each other, to do mutual learning, to figure out best practices, to begin to process some of these things. And I recommend that you just start doing that. Because in reality, that's what presbyteries originally were, There are those kinds of gatherings of processing stuff, and then this one is freed from the constraints of what's your rule book? Book of Order, is that what it's called? Yeah. And it's freed from those constraints. You can just simply be the body of Christ and do the one another's with each other and move through that process. By the way, I have a recommendation of who should facilitate both the Presbytery spiritual focus and scripture study and prayer and all that, and as well as these regional gatherings, and that's Randy Lovejoy. He's very creative in that way and is one that could really help orchestrate those kinds of experiences and learning processes, because really at the core of all this is going back to those roots of experiencing God and drawing upon Him and seeking Him and doing it collectively, because that's what the connectedness of the Presbyterians is all about. Really taking that kind of process seriously. Now, that's not a quick fix, but it's not just a symbolic act. It's an actual act of changing your behavior in a way that starts moving you toward the direction that you'd want to go. And the first key point is to reconnect with God in a serious way and connect with each other in a serious way to begin to discern what it is God is up to. Okay, any questions or comments on that strategic initiative?
Will you take a Baptist amen?
I would. Sure. Because it starts with you. You're the lead team. Now, and I understand how Presbyterians are governed with their committees and all that, and you know, the Presbyterians are organized in such a way as to avoid the abusive power of a bishop. And the downside of that structure that you set up to avoid abusive leadership, the downside is that it actually disempowers leadership. And it's quite an effective system to disempower leadership. But when people are sensitive to the Spirit of God, seeking Him in conversation and dialogue in true historic Presbyterian fashion, the leadership emerges because it's a discernment of where God is working in the midst. And where is it going to start? I've not seen change happening unless it starts with the people that are the leaders. And as lead team, you are leaders, and there's others here I know that besides just lead team, and that's okay. But the change starts with us and any significant change that's happened. So one of the core questions that I would ask, this is just a personal recommendation, is ask God this question: Lord, what needs to change in me personally to get ready for what you want to do? And if each one of us as individuals will take seriously that question and begin to listen to the Spirit of God and begin to struggle with those things that He begins to show us, that as we start experiencing that personal change, that helps to empower us to be the kinds of leaders that can help facilitate others to also engage in that journey. Second recommendation: develop a pilot network that equips churches to pursue missional discipleship. These may or may not be the correct words to use precisely, but I chose them as a means of communication. Because sometimes when we use the word discipleship, we only think in terms of spiritual growth and spiritual formation of believers. But discipleship, as we understand it scripturally speaking, is that we make disciples while we grow as disciples. That it's something that we can, right from the very beginning, start reaching out, and in that process we also then experience our own spiritual development and formation. Now, why did I say a pilot network? Well, one of the greatest ways to fail spectacularly in trying to revitalize a presbytery is saying, we're all going to do this. Everybody's going to become a part of a missional network. And you know what? Don't. Because you have people then that might comply, but they're not committed. And nothing worse than trying to go on a journey when people don't want to go. Just think of a time that you tried to take young kids on a hike when in fact they did not want to do it. Mommy, my feet hurt. Are we there yet? Can we go home? Why are we doing this? This is stupid. So you basically want it to be a pilot because it needs to be learned in how to do it. And you want to do the pilot with people that really want to do it, and churches that want to do it, with pastors that are committed to engage the process very fully. Let me, before I go on and unpack that a bit more, let me show you a little picture. This is the way church, in its classic sense, looks. I would suggest to you that church in today's world might need to look like that. The huge mistake to make, if you look at how renewal and revitalization happens throughout church history, is to try to simply go from here to here directly. It won't work, because you know from your own experience that even the simplest and most minor changes are met in a classic situation with lots of resistance, almost to the effect of trying to add a fourth member to the Trinity. And all we wanted to do was to change the worship time or rearrange the order of something in the service, and the reaction is like you're being heretical. Am I overstating it? No. In fact, none of us like change. We really don't. We really don't. So you can't go from there to there. So how does revitalization actually happen? If you look throughout church history, it does not start at the ecclesiastical center. It starts at the fringes. So you see some stuff going on, and something new gets started, and it starts growing and multiplying, and it's flourishing. Now the people that are sitting in the church over here are looking at that and seeing all this life and multiplication and stuff that's going on, and now they're caught in a dilemma. They're saying, why isn't that happening for us? The easiest way to get rid of that tension is to find some fault with that so that you can reject it and go back to your comfort zone. It's too charismatic, or it's not Presbyterian, or whatever. It's green. Yeah, that's it. You got it. You got it. So that's the challenge, because the historical response of a classic church system when faced with something new is to simply figure out a way to reject it. Then you can dismiss it and go back to being faithful. This happened for me when I was a kid. I think I was middle school. And I remember on a Sunday night, the pastor preached a sermon. And what predicated the preaching of that sermon is that the Calvary Chapel movement was starting to go on. And many of the students were going to their Saturday night concerts and enjoying those concerts with the new kind of music at that time. And that was not a problem. The problem was that they were invited to stay for the afterglow service, where they would try to encourage these young people to receive something that conservative Baptists were not supposed to get. And so the pastor preached an hour and a half one night, a very intellectual sermon, because he was an intellectual, a very intellectual sermon about this thing called tongues. I didn't know what tongues were, but I knew he was against them. And he had all the biblical reasons and this, that, and the other thing for why that was the case. But here's what happened as a consequence of that. This new music that was coming in was capturing the young people. The whole Jesus movement was going on. So what it did is it allowed a guitar to come into the Sunday evening service every once in a while. And so it emboldened some people to try something new, not at the center, but just kind of a little bit at the edge. And then from there, it starts growing and multiplying. So you're starting something new at the ecclesiastical fringe, if you would, that's a replication of that. But then the byproduct of that is that then it starts transforming the existing church. And so then it becomes something that maybe looks a little bit more rounded and a little bit more green-like. So I would suggest to you that revitalization and transformation of the existing comes as a byproduct of starting new things. And that's one of the things you've been doing well, is by trying new initiatives and trying different things and experimenting here and there. It's helping to give a picture of some stuff that can happen. And then the question is that how can that empower people then to be able to start taking it inside and trying some things themselves? That's why I'm suggesting starting a missional type network that's like about here, but still connected to the church, where the church leadership wants to learn how to grow into this. And so it really is focused on how do you make disciples while you grow as disciples. And that means engaging in the harvest, engaging with people that are not yet followers of Jesus, because that's what disciple means. It means apprentice, as you well know. And so how do we help people to do that? Well, the first question you have to ask is really, what does a disciple look like? Because if you ask people what's a disciple, the answers very often are very vague and not very precise and not terribly helpful. You know, they go to church, they read their Bible, have a daily quiet time, whatever. But I think it has to go a little bit deeper than that. I think what it really means is to live and love like Jesus. For your consideration, I did some work with Dr. Charles Ridley, and we developed a profile of what a disciple looks like. Now, in saying that, I'm not saying this is the perfect profile of a disciple, but it's a great starting point. And so we looked at the scripture and took a lot, and we discovered there are 8 dimensions. Starting first with experiencing God at the roots. And then you can see the behavioral expressions of what that looks like in concrete terms, but not being methodological. Because, see, some people experience God very deeply and profoundly through creation. Other people experience God very deeply in service to others. Some people experience God deeply through the study of Scripture and prayer, you know, through worship, various other components. But it's that grounding and rootedness in who God is that's really critical. And then responsiveness to the Spirit is the trunk. And then there's like 5 different branches that go around the tree. Sacrificial service, authentic relationships, generous living, personal transformation, making disciples. And then all that together, collectively, it results in community transformation, addressing social justice issues, care of creation, all sorts of things, healing and reconciliation. You know, it's this kind of profile, if you look at those 40 different characteristics of disciples, has enough to please and offend everyone. For a number of years, I was ignorant to and blind to the need for compassion and justice. and I was in a Renovari group that had the 5 streams of Christian faith, and you'd ask these 5 questions and talk about it in a small group. And 4 of the 5, I always had something to say, and something that I was tracking on, in terms of what promptings of the Spirit I had, or what temptations did I face, or what did I get out of the reading of Scripture, various things. But the one on how did you work for peace and justice, I didn't have anything. And week after week after week after week after week, I finally fatigued on the fact of, look, I'm growing in these 4 areas. I'm not doing anything in this area. Either this is something God wants, in which case I need to get on with it, or if it's not, I can just skip it and not worry about it. So I started picking up my Bible, and lo and behold, I discovered that God cares a lot about this stuff. In fact, He talks about it all the time. And when He gets really mad at His people, it's because they've been neglecting the poor, they've been abusing, and all that sort of stuff. Well, it revolutionized me. But how did that come about? Because I was looking at a profile of a disciple in a community and asking the tough questions of each other to figure out, where is God prompting me, and how does He want me to grow, and how does He want me to move forward? And now I spend a considerable amount of time in those kinds of areas myself personally. In fact, it's more meaningful than some of the other things I used to do. But nevertheless, that's the thing. You have to know what a disciple really looks like. And then you have to say, okay, but how do we then do this? And I love Hebrews 10:24 and 25, because I think this is a verse that kind of captures the essence of what a presbytery at its best is all about. Let us consider how to stir one another up to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together as the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. If it's Jesus, let us know what He said. Otherwise, where was I? Ring, that's it. Oh, at your best, consider, to think about deeply, right? To ponder, to think about what? How to stir one another up. To what? Love and good deeds. The character development, the actions, the holistic development. And doing that in community, meeting together, processing to be able to discern what it is God is saying and help each other to take the next faithful step. That's what I'm talking about, a network for missional discipleship. To set that up, first off, I would suggest that there a few people like a Randy and Nick and a few others, connect and figure out what is their profile, what do they agree upon in terms of what a disciple looks like. Then start dealing with the processes of coming alongside in community, and there's different ways to approach that, to experiment with things. But here's the critical issue. I've been working with this sort of stuff with Chuck Ridley, and he brought up something very, very profound. That part of the issue is if we know clearly what the end product is, and we understand the kinds of processes that get there, but then you have to ask yourself the question, how does change and transformation really, really happen in between those two? And part of the key is addressing your fears. Addressing your fears. And, then there's various fears that we can have that are keeping us from engaging with what God wants and cooperate with this mission that God has given us of making disciples while we grow as disciples. And so this kind of a network, I think there's 4 characteristics of it. It's intentional. It's very deliberate. It's developmental in the sense that it helps people stretch, to take the next step, to stimulate them to love and good cheering them on, but helping to stretch them. It's also supportive, and it's very focused on that mission, the great ends of the church, making and multiplying disciples that live out the kingdom principles, which then brings the whole holistic part of the gospel, word and deed, together. I like to use the illustration of rubber bands and shoelaces. Rubber bands, if there's no stretch, there's no growth. Too much stretch, you snap. The secret for development is enough stretch that it's uncomfortable but you can grow, but not so much that you're overwhelmed, or so little that you never do anything. So rubber bands. The second image for this developmental stage, and also the supportive stage, is shoelaces. Tie people together. Come alongside of each other, support each other in this journey. We don't do this well all by ourselves. We do it well in community. And so that's the process of making disciples while growing as disciples. And that gets you then involved in the focus of vision, starting where Jesus started, discovering responsible people, developing others holistically, stretching toward what's next, and mobilizing other disciplers. Now, it doesn't matter what the methodologies are. Jesus said, make disciples. In other words, what I've done with you as apprentices, apprentice other people into following and baptizing them and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded. Now, so this one will require a little bit of design, and it will require some really focused attention to help you move along in this way. Now, this is the kind of networks that I've created many different kinds of networks through the years, starting back in, oh good grief, 1990. So there's proven principles of how to journey together in a very focused, learning community, supportive environment. But it will be very important to make sure you have the right people in it, you go through a process well, and it's an experiment. Don't force people into it. Discover it as you go. But here's the critical piece. The experimentation needs to be connected to the local church. It needs to connect to the local church in some way. And that's very, very vital. And the pastor, he or she, needs to be integrally involved in it. And here's the thing that I've discovered, that when you see this kind of a transformation process take place inside of a church, without exception, the senior pastor is significantly engaging in the harvest. Where it does not develop, without exception, the senior pastor is not engaged in intentional, deliberate relationships in the harvest. I have yet to meet a single exception to what I just said. Now, here's the encouraging news. It does not seem to matter whether the pastor is terribly successful or not in those relationships. What matters is that he or she is out there trying. And if they're out there trying, they may stumble, they may fail, they may fall flat on their face, but they just keep getting up and keep trying, and somehow that allows an empowerment to happen for others to then move out in faith and go forward. That's encouraging to me, for sure. Now, there's a lot more I could say about that, but that's a strategic direction, because what you want to do is do an experiment and do it in a safe place with committed people. It'll keep failing and failing and failing and failing until you start seeing some sparks begin to happen. Then you discover what God is doing and figure out what's behind that, and then it can start spreading and multiplying. And then you can be more informed as you invite others into that journey. Does that make sense? So you don't want the people that have the least amount of faith for this, because they try one little thing and it failed. Oh, I'm never going to do that again. You know, that's not the place. What you want to do is you want to get some of those multiplies things going, and then that'll empower others to start joining in the journey. Any questions or comments on what I just said? Yes?
In my perception, we've got 2 or 3 different independent efforts going on right now. And as I listen to you, I think the thing that strikes me is that you're attempting to sustain without having a fully blown methodology to assess what's successful and what isn't, and to modify those efforts. It's almost like we've cast it in concrete, as you warned, and we're just trying to propagate it, and we're gonna throw all the resources we can behind any one of these without saying, how do we need to modify what we're doing? And it strikes me that in some ways they're almost independent of the Presbytery.
Bob, will you, to the extent possible, repeat?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, just so we get it on.
Yeah, the observation was that the Presbytery has tried many different things, or putting efforts into a lot of different approaches.
Not so much the Presbytery as independent programs, if it
Oh, okay.
where we're not directly in control, but we're supporting.
Oh, supporting other initiatives in that regard.
Yes, exactly.
And then the question is,
And bridges and
yeah, and the question is, how can we learn from those experiences in a way to then align our efforts in a more focused way?
And encourage modification.
And encourage
Just
modification.
Don't freeze it and try to make it work.
Right. Yeah, to force the model.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I call that the tyranny of the model.
Mm-hmm.
And see, I learned that in one stage where I was developing something and it was kind of innovative in our church as a church plan, back then, and I was working with one consultant and Carl George, and he said, and because I made some comment about how I want this to really work so that we can replicate it all over the place. And he says, Bob, don't fall prey to the tyranny of the model. Just get something that works in your context. Then you can figure out what are the principles behind that and figure out how that could be then spread to others. And I think that's your point exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we need to press on, but you understand why we're doing this, because this would help then inform what does effective disciple making disciples that are holistic and all of that look like. Then that can easily spread, because people will do better if they can see a pattern to follow. Most people aren't, and most churches aren't innovators. Most leaders are not innovators. And that's okay. They have too many innovators and we'd be just total chaos. You need to have some patterns to be able to follow to move forward well. But in a principled kind of way, not in a structured methodological kind of way. And so the processes of doing that, and what I want to say of that network, it begins to approximate what a good presbytery actually looks like. Because there's commitment, there's a clear focus and a goal, there's accountability, there's encouragement, there's challenging, there's seeking God together, learning from each other, cooperating, but each one doing what God has called them to do, but having the same clear goal in mind. That's what we're talking about here. And it begins to move that to a much more effective learning process that it increases ministry effectiveness. Are you still with me? It gets worse. The next one is the big one. Are you sure? I can go on? Transform pastoral leadership development process. The system that you have to select pastoral leadership is completely broken. And the type of leaders that are needed are not being produced in the quantities necessary out of the seminaries. Requiring an MDiv degree to serve as a pastor will not reach the harvest. God will raise up others to reach the harvest. and you can sit on the sidelines and get a few here and there. But I did some research and work with Chuck Ridley. We did some research on what does a profile of a senior pastor look like in today's context.
Is that what does it look like or what should it look like?
What should it look like?
Thank you.
What are the competencies and accompanying micro skills that are necessary to effectively pastor in today's world? And you'll see that the competency area, and this was done, by the way, through a methodology called job factor analysis. And so we interviewed lots and lots and lots and lots of pastors, and then looked at effective ones that were actually reaching people, making disciples, and doing all that, and versus those that were not. And here were the competency areas and the accompanying micro skills that go with it. Now, you won't have time to study this, and I gave it to you simply just to give you an idea of the complexity of the job. But I would just ask yourself this question. You look at these areas, which of those does the seminary equip people to do? Now, I am not saying, don't hear me saying that I think seminary education is not valuable. I have 2 degrees. One of them is from Fuller, Doctor of Ministry. I have an MDiv. I'm not opposed to seminary education. But here's the problem. If you only have your pool for pastoral leadership and for church planters be the seminary graduates, there's the size of the population. Now, may I suggest to you that of all the seminary graduates, it might look like that. The number that actually have the competencies to do it might look like that. The number of churches that are needed, the number of people that need to be reached, far exceeds the output of those if you can find them. Because one of the things that seminaries do not do is they do not develop leaders. A person is a leader when they come into seminary, and hopefully most of the time they're still a leader by the time they get out. And so there are some leaders that go through and they kind of rattle the cages a lot and various kinds of things, but your pool of people to draw from is not sufficient. I say this, that you need to figure out how to develop your own pastoral leaders and your own church planters. I'm not saying throw away the seminary. Here is the strategic shift that you need to make. Historically, you've required an MDiv degree as a prerequisite for pastoral work. In other words, it's a pre-service training. It needs to shift to a in-service training. In other words, the shift that needs to happen, because there's nothing in a degree that says you're competent or qualified to minister. You could be, but there's nothing in the degree itself that equips people. It means you can take classes, you can pass exams, and you can articulate good, sound theology, and a few other things, some preaching, some other kinds of things. What you need to shift to is a character and competence-based approach. Because biblically speaking, elders, mostly it's talking about character. 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1. There's one competence there, able to teach, manages their household well. There's a few that are a little bit more behavioral in their orientation. But it's character and competence. So what kind of competence do you need at the core of an effective pastoral leader? One that can make disciples, who make disciples. One who can start groups that follow Jesus and raise up other leaders to do the same thing. Isn't that the essence of the core of the foundation of the DNA of what Jesus' ministry was all about? I think so. So, find those people. That's why I suggested the previous initiative of Start the Missional Disciple Making Network, or whatever you're going to call it, because out of that you start seeing people that are starting to be fruitful, seeing people come to faith, they form groups that multiply those groups, etc. And a person that could evangelize, disciple, and multiply other group leaders is a potential pastor, a potential church planter, if not just a potential ministry leader inside a congregation to lead a group of people, right? So, develop those people and then pray about who is the ones that God might be calling to become pastors. Then it's relatively easy to ramp them up biblically and theologically, especially if your discipling processes incorporate a lot of scripture reading as a part of their formation process. My friend Neil Cole developed a thing called, now he calls it a greenhouse. Before he called it a pastor factory, which is totally non-organic term. It was actually borrowed from, the term was actually borrowed originally from Hope Chapel. Ralph Moore, when he was serving at Hermosa Beach, in a 10-year period of time, saw 50 churches get started out of his church. 50. Half of those were lay people. The other half were people he brought on to the staff, developed them, and sent them out. But what they would do was simply this. They had, their church was based upon small groups called mini churches, M-I-N-I, mini, like small, small churches. And they would identify the leaders that had led people to Jesus and had them follow in the faith, who discipled them to grow and raised up somebody else to lead another small group doing the same thing. So that was the criteria. So they'd make a list of all the leaders that had done that. Then they would pray over that list and ask God for discernment to say, who is God calling among these people to become a church planter? And after they got discernment from God, they would go talk to that person. And they'd say, Vicki, we've been praying about this, and da-da-da-da, and we believe that God may be calling you. Would you pray about this? She does, or he does, and they go through that process and get confirmation. And if you heard from God well, then it's probably tracking fine. Then they would enroll them in a 9-month intensive process to ramp them up theologically. They would meet once a week on a Monday night for anywhere from 3 to 5 hours. They would each read two or three books on the topic of the week. And the 2 or 3 books, by the way, weren't the same 2 or 3 books. Everybody got different books from different perspectives. So there wasn't even a set curriculum. They would read various theological perspectives, and everybody came prepared to lead the discussion. And they'd swap around, etc. And they did this for 9 months to help ramp them up theologically. Then they would develop a proposal to go plant a church. And then once they'd gathered 40 people in small groups, they would give them small startup money and turn them loose. Or they'd also let them preach on Sunday nights in their church. That's when Sunday night services existed. And let them recruit as many people as they could to come with them. In some cases, the people got up, I want you to come to Denver. I want you to quit your job. I want you to move with me to Denver and help reach the people in Denver. Now, do you see what we're doing here? If you just start getting on the business of what Jesus is about, making disciples while growing his disciples, and living as kingdom people in the world, and then you see groups begin to start and grow and multiply, those people that are the key persons that God is using in those ways is the pool of people then you need to identify and then figure out how to get them up to speed. And then you can actually ordain them. And I discovered something. You do not have to have an MDiv degree to be ordained in this presbytery. It requires a 3/4 vote of the presbytery. Period. So there's nothing in your polity that prevents you from doing this. To adopt a character and competency-based ministry approach. Now, you obviously want your pastors to be competent theologically. You want them to be reformed, and so forth. I get that. That's not a problem. But you can do it. Then, after you've ordained them, then have them start taking extension courses and start working on their degree, if that's appropriate for them. In other words, I'm not opposed whatsoever to getting good, solid theological education. In fact, from my experience in teaching in a seminary, is that those that have ministry experience are the ones that ask the best questions and grow the best as you're interacting on these theological issues. I can always tell the difference between people that actually have ministered to somebody from the questions they ask from somebody that hasn't ministered to anybody ever. Because those that aren't involved in ministry ask stupid questions. And frankly, if they're asking a question that I've never had to face, or any of my friends or colleagues have ever had to face, and I know of no one that's ever had to face that particular thing, it probably doesn't need to be talked about. Are we okay? Now, this is a profound shift. See, here's what's going on. Historically, you have a shortage of leaders. And the way that historically is you seek to recruit them to solve the shortage. Years ago, there was enough pool of ready-made people that you could meet that need that way. But the long-term solution is actually to develop your own. But the problem is that there's a delay. It takes time. And what I've discovered in some groups is that the more successful they are at recruiting their church planters that are ready to go, and pastors, that it has an inadvertent side effect of diminishing the commitment to develop your own. Because it's harder to develop your own. It's messy. Has your growth been really clean? It has struggles. It has issues. Mine has. So do you see what we're talking about here? This is what you need to work on, is develop your own to be able to get there. Now, I do say that it would be very important, and this is a place where Nick is one of the people that's very, very strategic here. Nick is great at spotting talent. And if we can find some really sharp, ready-to-made people that get plugged in as pastors, as church planters, that will help kickstart some of the leadership needs that are needed short term. But you have to go along with a longer term commitment to develop your own, because that increases your capacity. Because what happens if you fall on recruitment, the pool gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and the quality gets less and less and less. And that's what I've discovered in mainline churches, is the quality of the MDiv grads is diminishing over time. Is this true? And so therefore it's getting harder and harder to spot the kind of pastoral leaders or church planters that are needed. Now here's the cool part. If you go about the development process, you'll start having an excess of people and be able to start blessing people and see new things begin to start and to grow. Now for cross-cultural ministry and some ethnic groups, you need to do some recruiting. You're not going to develop some of the ethnic leaders, right? You're going to have to recruit them, but do it in a way where they're committed to show that they can actually multiply and develop long term, because that increases capacity. Now this is fundamental, folks. That one, and I know some people are going to really scream at this. But Jesus did not require an MDiv for any of the apostles that he commissioned. In fact, one of them was a real scoundrel. They were uneducated. What was the difference? They'd been with Jesus. See, that's what we need. We need leaders that are vitally connected to God, who are out there, in spite of their fears, engaging, seeing God do stuff that only God can do and begin to raise up people and multiply. It's not easy. But that's going to be the necessity. If you're going to move forward and have a future, you must take responsibility to raise up your own pastoral leadership and not abdicate your responsibility to the seminary. Use the seminary for what it can do well, which is equip people after they're already equipped and help them to grow and think theologically and biblically. And I think that's very important. You know, it's very myopic to ignore those kinds of things. No, the seeds of it are already here.
Yes.
I think the issue is embrace it and own the responsibility that you have. That's what I'm saying. Own it. But let it flow out of a disciple-making focus, because what I've discovered when you have people and you do consulting work and you say, what are your leadership challenges? You list out all the leadership challenges. You exhaust their list. Then you go and say, now, of these things on the list, which of these are actually discipleship problems and not leadership issues? What percentage of that list do you suppose are discipleship issues? Between 70 and 90%. See, the problem that we have in our churches is that our churches are filled with non-following believers led by non-growing disciples. And it's out of fruitful discipleship that emerges fruitful leadership. And so that Initiative 2 and Initiative 3 are intricately linked together. And you want to know what's going to make the difference for your future in a strategic direction. Those first three are the big ones. Seeking God together. Starting to learn how to make disciples holistically and effectively that make disciples. And then take ownership of the raising up of pastoral leadership and church planters, even missionaries. Yeah, the question is the groups that have adopted that kind of
Yes,
policy, is it
right.
still working? There's two things that happened historically. And I don't want to speak about any one particular group, but I'll speak about, I'll speak as because I've observed several of these situations. Number one is that the people do in fact start pursuing theological reflection, biblical study as a part of what they do for their development, because as they're out their ministry and they realize they need to get a deeper well in that way, and so theological reflection. So there are more that do that. They also do more that, like pursuing spiritual direction and going deeper on that side of the equation. But the other thing that I have noticed is that sometimes then people start going down that path too much, and then they have to start returning back to their roots. And there's numbers of groups now that are returning back to their roots again. But you know, so it's not either or. But if I had to choose, I will always take the practitioners that are fruitful and then help them to be able to think more effectively than trying to take somebody who's thought themselves, you know, way beyond their obedience, and then try to help them to try and figure out how to be connected with people. I mean, that's a no-brainer.
No,
Tina?
Thank you. I heard the either or, and I was not an advocate for biblical training myself initially. I love those words that you started out with about the disciples. And so when I actually went to Bible college initially, I went kind of kicking and screaming. And I remember I went to a Pentecostal Bible college, and Jack Hayford, who is the president of the Foursquare denomination, he was actually retraining the Foursquare church because he felt that the pastors were really out of sync. They were not giving good, solid sermons. They were feeling sermons. They weren't theological sermons. And he really was pulling in the pastors in all of the churches at that time and really bringing them into alignment with proper training. And so I kind of think that perhaps it could be a both and. I also, being in seminary not too long ago, 10 years now, or whatever it was when I went, I really did see a disconnect with a lack of leadership, where the students were quite intelligent, but there was a lack of leadership, where there were those of us who came with 20 years of leadership and CEO experience, and you had students that were quite intelligent. They could nail those scores, and they could tell you the systematics off the top of their head, but they had no leadership. And I feel that I have that concern of what happened in like the Foursquare church, where it was all feeling, and they sort of read the Bible and they had no background, and also they had no leadership skills either. So I feel like, though I love the idea of no MDiv, how does one make sure that we have pastors that are qualified, that have that strong leadership?
Well, they have that set of competencies and micro skills, and a good theological framework. But see, a good theological framework does not require a degree to get.
That I agree. I do agree.
And here's the interesting thing about the process. Many new movements of God are often at the grassroots, are often very messy, and thousands of people come to faith through the process. Then they figure out, okay, we gotta solidify a little bit, and they get into that process, and that helps. Some of that backfilling that you were describing of what Jack Hayford did, it would be evidenced in numerous groups. Then what happens in church history, if you look back, it was about the 1890s that the church hit a peak and then started the decline. And one of the core decisions that was made was requiring the degree for pastoral leadership. And so I'm all for theological and biblical competence. I'm for ministry competence. I'm for leaders that know how to connect with people and have high emotional intelligence and all that kind of stuff. So it's not either or, but we don't want to inhibit or limit the pool of people, because the pathways will be different.
You started out this afternoon very kindly saying that what we've been doing as Presbyterians has worked very well in the past, which was nice of you to say. But at the time of the American Revolution, the Presbyterian Church was both the largest and most geographically widespread church in the nation. And as a result of the westward movement, well, the people were heading west, and the Presbyterians said we need to train up leaders to reach those people, so we brought them back to seminary for 4 years and sent them out, but by the time we sent them out, we were sending them out to the east, and we never hit the west. Whereas the Baptist and the Methodist tended to throw a lot of untrained people against the wall
And see
the
what,
theology later.
yeah, that's true. What Francis Asbury said of the Baptists, he said, like ghosts, they haunt us from place to place.
And that's why if you drive through many smaller communities in the American West, you'll find the Baptist church. It's always on the main street. You'll find the Methodist church. If there's a Presbyterian church, it's hidden 3 blocks off the main drag somewhere back in a residential neighborhood behind an electrical substation. And because we got there so much later.
Yeah, so just to affirm, it's character and competence. That's what we're looking for. And how you get there can be varied.
Which means rebooting Committee on Preparation for Ministry in so many ways. Rebooting that way of thinking when someone comes. I mean, and that's the part. And recently, joining the committee, I mean, it's exciting. It's frightening. It's going to be a lot of work. 45 years, you said, right? You know, but to me, that seems like an exciting thing.
Yeah, it's one of the issues that needs to be addressed down the road.
Right.
Fortunately, you have a little bit of time to address it because it's going to take time to develop these folks.
Right.
And so it's not a decision that has to be made next week. You might have to circle around and look around your ranks already and figure out who's already there, and then what do they need for a personalized development path to be able to help them move forward. I'm sure you have numbers of those that are out there. And so that's an issue to start working with. Okay, those are the big ones. There's one more real big one, and then I got 2 other ones that are logical and I think it'll make sense. So I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. Because if you're not going to kill me off the first 3, then the last 3 are going to be reasonable. All right. See that? Never mind.
We're ready. Go.
You want to prioritize staffing to facilitate ministry transition. I recommend that you hire Randy at 30 hours a week to help facilitate this transitional leadership that's needed. The first initiative, the second, facilitating the second initiative, overseeing the third. Partnering with people like Nick, who can help strategically in this process as well. But let Randy be the one to help facilitate and lead this charge. And it's because, see, what happens is the way transformation is going to happen is you got to start the new thing alongside of what is. You know, I'm not saying blow up the old stuff. I mean, that would be too disruptive for people's faith. It just would be a killer. Start the new thing alongside of, and see it start to flourish, but start investing your efforts toward this goal, toward this thing that you're really starting to move that direction. And so it requires some dedicated leadership. And I believe that Randy would be the best person to facilitate that in partnership with Nick and others to help that journey forward. And then as that begins to succeed, there'll be the transformation will happen inside of this system. And I would suggest that for Randy, I've thought about this, and I've actually talked with him about this, so I'm not surprising him. Everything I said about Nick, I might be surprising him, but I have had a conversation with Nick as well, but not at the level of we'd have with Randy. What needs to happen is some leadership that's free to focus on those first 3 initiatives especially. And Ken will still have an important role of overseeing the whole thing. And that I would suggest that Randy is held accountable through an accountable leadership process similar to Winning on Purpose. It's a book that talks about accountable leadership. And every 4 months to have Randy come and here's what's been accomplished and report to someone like myself in the presence of the lead team and actually have a session where you hear what he's accomplished, what challenges he's facing, what his goals are for the next 4 months, etc. So there's an account of here's the goals I set, here's what we have accomplished, and going from that. But the lead team hearing that dialogue and that intensive audit, if you would, every 4 months, then starts raising the issues that the preparation Committee on Preparation for Ministry are starting to hear, and that begins to then process their discussion there, and Property and Finance begins to think about their issues and implications of that, and Commission on Ministry starts dealing with their stuff, and the others. So it's an ECG and so forth. It all starts helping. The system then starts benefiting from the learnings of what's going on and starts dealing with some of the stuff in preparing the way for future change. That's a healthier way to keep stuff connected, but not have it be micromanaged in a sense of it needs to be freed to be able to do the new thing. And will there be some mistakes made? Yes. We've talked about how to get some strategic people that are even outside of the Presbytery, that are Presbyterians in key places that understand Presbyterian history and heritage and all that, to even do some checks to make sure that what is being developed is still thoroughly Presbyterian in its roots. You know, we have to be sane about this and wise in this process, but that's what I would suggest that you do, that you put some staffing toward that. And I think Nick has some strategic places where he can help, especially in that second initiative of the disciple-making network and missional network and so forth, that would be very critical. And so that's what I suggest that you do, because if you're going to embrace the initiatives, you got to say, where's the leadership coming from? And I believe that just like Nick is the one that helps in the church planting area and is the right guy for that spot, I think Randy's the right guy for this one. And I have a great deal of confidence in him for that. The next one is to manage financial and physical assets to maximize fruitfulness. Here's the deal. It's a stewardship. The goal is clearly in mind. And if you embrace that goal and say, we're going to pursue this, seeking God, pursuing this mission together to pass on faith to the next generation, then you start to have to take a John 15 approach and ask yourself the question, what's not bearing fruit? Cut it off. What has a lot of activity but isn't producing disciples? See, when I was a kid, I loved to hang out with my dad, and we had fruit trees up on the top of our hill, you know, kind of a row of fruit trees, and once a year he'd go up there and prune those things. And so I'd take the dog and sit on the hillside and pet the dog. I'm 8, and watch my dad do this. And I'm watching him cut off the dead stuff, you know, and I'm sitting there. My leadership gifts were still coming out early on, and I was going, "Yep, good job, Dad." I'm saying that to myself, you know, just that's a good choice there. That was a good one to get rid of that one, you know, and so forth. And then he went down to those ones that were way down near the roots, you know, near the base, and these young stuff that was coming up, and he starts cutting those off. And that's when, as an 8-year-old, I just couldn't stand it. So I had to rebuke my father. And I said, "Dad, what are you doing? Those things are so much younger and have a little more leaves and life. You know, why are you cutting those off and leaving those old gnarly ones there?" I don't think I used the word gnarly. I don't think that was in my vocabulary at the time. But anyway, had I known that word, I would have used it because it was the perfect word. And he says, "Bob, you don't understand. Those are called suckers. They don't produce any fruit. In fact, if you leave them on there, they take the life out of the tree, and you have less fruit and smaller fruit." And that's when I learned a very important lesson. Just because you have a lot of activity, just because you have a lot of numbers, does not necessarily mean you have disciples. And so therefore, it goes two ways. The dead stuff, you know, you may have to have the courage to get rid of it. The other stuff, you have to say, is it not producing what you want it to produce? Then you got to get rid of it. And then what does it say with the stuff that does produce fruit? You prune it. And here's the secret to greater fruitfulness. It's not doing more. It's doing less. It's doing more of the right less. Because when you cut off that fruitful one, then all the energy of the tree goes right to that point and explodes in even greater fruitfulness. And so part of this management, this stewardship issue, it's really critical to take a look at that and to say, is it helping us to actually achieve the results we're trying to achieve? And that means some readjustments in how things are spent, looking at the results. The other principle here is that for those that are fruitful, pour more into that. Take a look at the new churches. You know, there's I know Tina's got some cool stuff going on in hers, but the what's it called? Light Shine. Light Shine. You know what? 70 or 80% of the people they've reached were previously not churched. I mean, that's fruitful. They're running up against facility issues. Well, property and finance should be saying, how can we get ahead of this thing so they don't truncate themselves by the shoe telling the foot how big it should grow. You know, then there's other things. I've not studied all of those, so I'm just giving one example that I'm aware of. Okay, so but the point is, find where God is working and where He's blessing, and where could a strategic investment accelerate their growth. That's what we're talking about. This management, this stewardship process. Here's another one, principle: invest in provenness. Invest where there's fruitfulness. Not with a hope so. You know, ordinary Christians are supposed to go make disciples. Those that are particularly fruitful in making disciples who make disciples and make disciples, it might be a wise investment to invest in them so that they can free up more time to be able to do more of that. And finally, provide compassionate and effective care for struggling churches. The strategic direction forward still needs to figure out how to provide the kind of care for existing churches and not just throw them on the shelf. Teresa, you're doing great work out there. You know, who knows what the fruit of it's going to be, but there's you're given the kind of leadership that's necessary to help move things forward. But see, here's the problem though. Fundamentally, here's where existing presbyteries and other judicatory groups go wrong. The struggling church asks for help. You try to come alongside and help, but they don't release control. So they're holding the keys to the kitchen, and they won't give up the keys to the kitchen. But you really need to go into the kitchen and start cooking things differently. And so what you have to do is say, let's form a covenant here. I'll help you, but you got to give up the keys. And then together we'll go into the kitchen and we'll figure out how to make new stuff. Groups that have been effective in doing this kind of work with turnaround churches forms a covenant, because the church, in asking for help, has realized it's no longer autonomous. It's no longer self-sufficient, self-supporting, self-sustaining. And so therefore you can't expect to hang on to all of that. So make an agreement to say, look, we'll help you, but here's the cost. We want your leadership to submit their resignations. We'll bring a leader in to help you, and you'll follow what they say. They'll be supervised by somebody outside, to help make sure they're not doing crazy stuff. But the fact of the matter is that the very group that got it into that mess are the ones that are in power holding the keys, and you can't be effective in bringing change if they won't release their grip. And some churches won't do that. They'd rather die than change. To which I say, okay. And release the assets to pour it into fruitful stuff. Does that sound harsh? I think it's compassionate, because the way you're going at it is not giving them a chance to really thrive. Is there a guarantee of that kind of success? No. There's risks in all this stuff we're talking about. It's hard, but it's doable. So that's a whole other set of issues to deal with, but it's not the front burner issues. The front burner issues are the first ones that we talked about. Okay, comments or questions? Oh, let me say one other thing. One thought to think about. If you engage in this process well, what are the outcomes that would come from that? Think of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. What's the I Have a Dream speech? If God really had his way, and you sought him with all your hearts together, and start pursuing this, and saying, we may or may not succeed, we may or may not know how to get over these mountains, but we're going to keep trying and keep learning and keep pressing into God and to each other and partnering with others to get there for the glory of God. That's what we want. I think it can happen. If I didn't believe it, I wouldn't be here. Thank you for your patience.